What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you a meta-analysis for the end of this November, going on December 2017 format. Now that YCS Prague has come to a close, we have a lot to discuss because, surprisingly, even going from one event, which was YCS San Diego from the previous week, to another, YCS Prague, we have a lot to discuss in terms of card selection and the way the top cut as well as the meta has slightly evolved. So, without further ado, we're just going to get right into the pie chart. Now, as you guys look at the pie chart, you might notice that there are some similarities as well as some differences compared to something like YCS San Diego. The most glaring similarity is, yes, that SPYRAL is still in pretty much taking up 50% of the top 32 cut. And this really comes as no surprise because SPYRAL has definitively established itself as going on as the best deck of the format. But what's really interesting and what's different about this pie chart in comparison to YCS San Diego is when you compare it to the other half of the pie chart. When you're looking at the other decks, there was a lot of diversity in this top 32. I mean, there was Trickstar, there was Pendulum Magician, you had ABC, you had Dinosaur, you had Lightsworn. There was even other decks that they didn't even categorize as their proper deck because they just didn't even feel that that was necessary. But the fact that the other 16 decks in this top 32, 50% of the top 32 are comprised of these other decks is a really, really good sign in terms of, I guess, kind of a glimmer of hope that, you know, SPYRALs, as powerful as the deck is, aren't necessarily the dominating overlord that you might expect them to be. I definitely think that this is a huge improvement, also just since YCS San Diego, where we only had a few decks in the top cut, where this meta was much more diverse. I believe YCS Prague had around almost 1,400 players. I think it was 1,383 if my memory serves correct, and that's a really big YCS. It was bigger than YCS San Diego, and you have to remember, because since Europe doesn't get as many YCSs, people are more likely to turn out, and this is really, really awesome. Now, a lot of people might look at this and say, well, SPYRAL is still a problem that needs to be addressed, and that may be true, but we're going to discuss kind of some of the ways that SPYRAL is in fact evolving and how you can prepare yourself if you have a regional coming up, maybe you have a YCS if you're attending YCS Argentina, that's a very big deal, or just any major event, hell, even a locals if you have a very competitive locals, on how the meta has evolved and what you can do to prepare for it. So, obviously SPYRAL is the big elephant in the room here, and we're going to be discussing some of the card and tech choices a little bit later on. I'm going to get onto some of these other decks first, and then we're going to go ahead and discuss those singular choices. So, Trickstar is the biggest one here outside of SPYRAL, and this is where we saw a really big shift, because at YCS San Diego, we started to see how Trickstar was starting to take over as the second most dominant deck over Pendulum Magician. Now, a lot of people thought that Pendulum Magician was going to be second, and then Trickstar was going to follow suit in third, but it's funny because the opposite's actually happening, and we're seeing the reverse, and I think that's due in part to the fact that Trickstar and SPYRAL have very similar playstyles in the fact that both decks have a very compressed engine and don't require a lot of cards for those engines to work, meaning they can play a lot of hand traps to combat their SPYRAL matchup, and that those hand traps are going to help facilitate being able to play against SPYRAL, and then since their engine is so just condensed, they're able to pretty much churn out whatever they need to, and also not to mention that the fact that the deck can main Joel and Lockbird naturally in Trickstar Reincarnation can also just be a very disruptive card, especially now that SPYRAL has a lot of very sensitive one-ofs that if those cards get just hit out of the hand, the SPYRAL player is going to be in a lot of trouble. I think all of those factors combined contribute to Trickstar's success. I mean, hell, there were 7 Trickstars in the top 32. That's a very large cut of the top 32. I mean, you're looking at 25, just going on 25%, and I think that's a really big deal. Now, let's talk about Pendulum Magician, because that deck has pretty much fallen almost all the way to the bottom here, only with 2 of the top 32 slots going to Pendulum Magician, and that's a complete far cry from where it used to be, one of the most meta contenders of the format. But like I said, I think the fact that Pendulum Magician has a difficulty with running multiple hand traps because it affects the deck's consistency too much, paired with the fact that going into games 2 and 3, the deck has so many cards that can be a complete detriment to it, like Evenly Matched or Unending Nightmare, Dimensional Barrier. There's so many cards, and now Magical Spring as well, that people are prepared for this matchup, that the deck is still incredibly consistent and can churn out very powerful boards like Baguska or Ignister or Omega, and then be able to OTK you on the following turn. But the issue is, in comparison to some of these other decks, since SPYRAL is the best deck, I feel like Pendulum Magician has a much worse matchup versus SPYRAL than, say, something like Trickstar. So I think because of the way the meta has shifted, you're going to definitely see a much lower representation for Pendulum Magician. Now, don't get complacent, because you're still going to see Pendulum Magician in any large tournament because the deck is still incredibly strong, but you don't have to worry about it as much as you were before, because now it's no longer as big of a threat now that the meta is starting to be more defined and people are starting to figure out what's working and what isn't. I think one of the biggest things and biggest takeaways from YCS Prague was Lightsworn not only having 2 spots in the top 32, but also being in the finals of YCS Prague, almost being able to take first place at this event that was pretty much completely overrun by SPYRAL. That's a really, really big deal. And yeah, sure, the final match may be a bit more controversial, but I think it's really cool to see that a deck like Lightsworn is performing this well. Now, what are some of the contributing factors to its success? I think very similarly to a deck like Burning Abyss, Lightsworn doesn't really fall victim to hand traps as severely as some other decks. Now, don't get me wrong, if you're playing like a 60-card Lightsworn variant, you know, that Grass Looks Greener is still very susceptible to Ash, but so is Left Arm Offering and all these other different cards. But the advantage a deck like that has is that these 60-card builds have so many bombs or so many just big cards that if they don't get stopped, the Lightsworn player is going to be in such an advantageous position that it actually contributes to the success of it. You also have cards like Droll and Lockbird that don't really do much against Lightsworn as a whole. Ghost Ogre can be moderately effective, but again, that card's falling by the wayside already as is and has been relegated to the side deck for the most part, although some people still choose to main it. But overall, I think it's really cool to see that 2 Lightsworn players did make it to the top 32, and kudos to the guy who made it all the way to the finals, because in this meta, that is no easy feat, and I don't think anyone would have anticipated that had you asked them before YCS Prague if you expected Lightsworn in the finals. There was also ABC, and there was also a dinosaur player. There was also some Shaddoll dinosaur zombie deck. Like, there was some really interesting decks in this top cut, and if you want to see some of those more deck profiles more in depth, check out Lithium 2300's channel, because he was at the event and pretty much got every single deck profile at that event under the face of the fucking sun. But we're gonna move on to some other interesting things, and it's the fact that 2 World Chalice decks as well as a Infernoid deck bubbled with an 8-2-1 record. Now that's huge, because we saw at YCS San Diego that Infernoid also bubbled, but 2 World Chalice decks bubbling as well is really big, because there was also a World Chalice player at YCS San Diego who almost topped as well. So these are decks that are like on the fringe that you do have to keep in mind that you might see these decks at a larger event and prepare for them in some way or another, because you might see them on your journey to the top tables. So even though they didn't make the top cut, it's definitely notable that there were those other decks in the field and had that contention for the top cut. Now, I wanted to discuss some card choices specifically that we've seen transitioned into YCS Prague. Now, one of the biggest ones was the inclusion of Psy-Frame Gear Epsilon. For those of you who don't know what Epsilon is, it's essentially Psy-Frame Gear Gamma, but instead of negating effect monsters, it negates trap cards. And why this card was so popular was a basically countermeasure for Trickstar. Now, Trickstar played Trickstar Reincarnation, so essentially, if your opponent activates Trickstar Reincarnation, you can just drop the Epsilon, negate the Trickstar Reincarnation, then you get yourself an Omega, essentially, and you're going to be in really good shape, because not only did they waste the Reincarnation, Omega's going to rip a card out of their hand, and then you're able to go off with that Reincarnation, essentially hindering you from doing your plays. You could also theoretically use it against Evenly Matched as well, and that's a really good counter for that. So, really interesting tech there in the side deck that several players decided to go with, especially on the CCG team, team. And then there was also Mind Crush. Now, Mind Crush is a card that, again, we always see this card pop in and out of formats, especially once they become more well-defined, and this card is really, really interesting. Essentially, the theory behind it is very similar to Solemn Scolding in that it just kind of gives you this extra layer of protection to stop a multitude of cards, but for instance, Mind Crush can stop something like Evenly Matched. So for instance, if your opponent goes and enters the battle phase, you can flip up Mind Crush, call Evenly Matched, and now they have to discard all copies of it. The advantage that you have with Mind Crush over Solemn Scolding is the fact that Mind Crush will hit multiple copies, because for instance, if you Solemn Scolding one Evenly Matched and they have multiple, then it's not going to be looking too good for you and it's not really going to help. So if you kind of look at Solemn Scolding compared to Mind Crush, they hit a lot of the same cards, but there's slight advantages to one over the other, and when you're making your side deck, you might want to just consider which strengths of either card play better for your deck, and ultimately decide on which one of those you would prefer to include in your side deck. Hell, you might end up going with both. I mean, I don't really know, but it's a really cool choice that we've seen players use nonetheless. So guys, that's it for the meta analysis. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about this past week's meta analysis. I love when we get to this point in the game, when we start to see a format become more well-defined, players start making really interesting tech choices, not only in the side deck, but the main deck as well, and people start figuring out and really just honing, trimming down the fat of their main decks, and kind of just really getting in there and making for some really good competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! But guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always, subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content, and if you found this video helpful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.